Welcome back to Chapter 4, Examining Foreign Markets. In the previous section, we were looking at economic variables, and specifically, we were comparing some of the main economic variables between India and China. And as you can see in the graphic that we had before, China does indeed have a higher GDP than India. And we started to look at GDP per capita. So GDP is basically the output for a country. GDP per capita is that figure divided by population. In other words, it gives you a per person GDP, which can be rather helpful for comparison purposes. And as you can see here, at least up until 2014, India's GDP per capita was growing, albeit more slowly than China's. Another variable worth considering is inflation. And you can see that this, once again, this is India's. You can see that it's varied somewhat considerably. Inflation basically tells you, will their money be worth the same next month, or roughly next month, as it is now? So you can see why those figures are very, very important in terms of doing an economic analysis. Where would you find that information? Well, coming back to the CIA World Factbook, we can look at economy and we can get all of those figures that we just talked about. So this is for India, and they give you GDP in terms of purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity makes the numbers comparable. So if you looked at the GDP in India versus the GDP in the United States, just without making them comparable, that might be a little bit misleading because money goes a lot further in India. So purchasing power parity is a way of evening those out so that you're really making an apples to apples comparison. And you can see that it was 7.965 trillion in 2015. And then if we scroll down a little bit, we can see the purchasing power parity GDP per capita, which is meaningful. So in 2015, we've got $6,200. And the other thing I like about the CIA World Factbook is it tells us compared to the rest of the world. So you can see that India is number 158 in terms of GDP per capita. And if you scroll down, you can say, okay, out of 229 countries. So not a very affluent country by any wild stretch of the imagination. But as we said, it's important to look at growth rates. And it appears that their GDP is at least growing. So in terms of the economic analysis, we don't want to stop with just looking at GDP, GDP per capita, inflation. There are other figures that are also very important. For instance, I would encourage you to look at unemployment rates. Both in terms of the fact that, with more unemployed people, there are fewer people that can afford your product, but also because of unemployment does tend to lead to unrest, which precipitates another factor that we'll look at, i.e. political risk. So if you look at the variables within economics, there's a lot of really, really rich and interesting data. There's one other figure that I want to call your attention to. And to do that, to illustrate that point, I want to look at a totally different country in a different area of the world, and that's Equatorial Guinea in Africa. Equatorial Guinea has the highest GDP in Africa. And in fact, some of their affluent folks have quite a bit of money. Case in point, the president spent $55 million for a Boeing 737, and one of his sons has over 300 million in assets. So you might look at that, especially the GDP per capita, and say, okay, that's an attractive market. But that's a little bit misleading. Because in fact, 3/4 of the population of that country live below poverty. And it's so severe that when patients go to the hospital, they're expected to bring their own sheets. And if you hear that noise, that's an indicator of what they're sharing their hospital room with, rats. So it's definitely not an attractive market, not a good situation for the folks that live there. So to measure that, we would look at something called the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient looks at how wealth is spread out in a country. Is it evenly distributed? Is it unevenly distributed? So to look at that, I want to come back to India because that seems to be kind of our reference point. And look at what's called their Gini index and see how wealth is spread. I'll look at this one. Actually, I had Mexico up, so we'll look at Mexico first. So the Mexicans have a Gini, can you see it? A Gini coefficient of, there we go, 48.3 in 2008, which is the most recent year that the figure was available. And to be more equal, it is indicated by a lower number. So ideally, the closest you are to 0, but that's not realistic. So a very egalitarian society like Sweden would be close to 25. A country like the African country that I just mentioned would be closer to 50. So looking at that, you can see that Mexico is fairly stratified. In other words, wealth is not evenly distributed. And you might say, okay, what's the implication of that from a business perspective? Well, if you look at look at Mexico as a second world country, you might say, well, they can't afford luxury products. And that's absolutely not true. They can afford luxury products because there's a significant pool of folks who do have fairly high incomes. So I would encourage you to take a look at the Gini coefficient, perhaps for China, if that's the one that you want to discuss in the discussion forum, to see how evenly wealth is distributed. And I will tell you that India is more evenly distributed than Mexico. So moving onward, let's look at another Latin American country. And specifically, what I want to next consider is the area of political risk. And to do that, I want to talk about Lufthansa, the German airline, and that's the sound of the German airline taking off, moving away from Caracas, Venezuela. And the reason why Lufthansa and most other airlines are no longer, and it's ironic that that's not Lufthansa in the picture, but that's okay, you get the point. Most major airlines no longer want to do business in Venezuela because Venezuela is having severe economic problems, as you probably know. And as a result of that, they are no longer making foreign currency available. So the foreign airlines are worried that they won't get paid. So looking at political legal factors, can you see one of the factors that we just touched on? Currency exchange controls. That's when a country is worried that they will run out of foreign exchange and or they don't want products imported. So they limit how much foreign exchange is available to folks in their country who want to buy products from foreign countries or foreign companies. Interestingly enough, Venezuela is also an excellent illustration of political risk in that there is quite a bit of unrest because their economy is in such a shambles right now. And I'm going to provide a link for you to take a look at the level of political risk and the way that is rated. But I'm also giving you an example right here of an illustration of political risk. And specifically, the Kimberly-Clark company, they make quite a number of consumer products, and they were fairly recently taken over by the government of Venezuela. So political risk is something you would want to consider, but even more broadly, you'd want to consider what is the political situation in that country? Are there laws that would be either advantageous or disadvantageous to me? So, in addition to some of the aforementioned factors, one of the prime factors you want to look at is, are there tariffs that will be placed on my product? And briefly, I want to talk about the different types of tariffs. An export tariff is less common than an import tariff, but they do exist. Usually in countries, let's say African countries, that have hard time collecting taxes or getting money into the public coffers some other way. So they actually tax products that they export. An import tariff, which is by far the most common, is a tax placed on products coming into the country. And as you may recall in Chapter 3, one of the examples we had was a shorty wetsuit, and you can see in the picture that shorty wetsuit on a cute shorty. And I said at that time that there was what's called an ad valorem tariff placed on the shorty wetsuit. And an ad valorem tariff is, and if I recall correctly, it was about 7%, a tax on the value of that product. So 70% of the cost of that wetsuit is added on top of it. A specific tariff, on the other hand, is just based on the number of products, not on their value, number and type of product. Okay, so one of the more important areas in political legal factors is non-tariff barriers. Tariff barriers are fairly overt. You can see if somebody's slapping a tax on your product. However, it's very important to understand if there are other constraints that will make it hard for you to get your product into a country that are less overt. And these are what are called non-tariff barriers. So examples are import licenses, red tape. You may find that you can import the product, but then it just sits on the dock while you're waiting to get all the paperwork done. Government standards and testing, quotas, government procurement barriers, and service and investment barriers. I'll give you one example. I remember doing a transaction in India a number of years ago that took 7 trips to the bank. It was the type of thing the United States would have taken literally just one phone call. So it's a good example of red tape being a barrier to doing business in that country. So how can you find out more about political and legal factors? Well, there are a number of resources. One that's very good are the country commercial guides, and I'll add a link to that. It looks like the link that I just tried to access didn't work, but I'll come back to that. Let's look at cultural factors. In the intro vignette, we looked at the lonely hearts in China. China is a fascinating market for IKEA in that the way that folks utilize that space is very different from what you might see in the United States. And so one thing that's very common in IKEA in China is folks sleeping at IKEA. And you might say, well, that's unusual. I haven't seen that in the United States. I mean, folks literally crashed out taking a snooze. But if you look at Trompenau's classifications of cultures, he talks about specific cultures where there's a large public space and a small private space, and those are kept very separate. So a good example of that would be the home country of IKEA, which is Sweden. Another good example would be the United States. But there are other cultures where the private and the personal really overlap, and that's called a diffuse culture. There's less distinction between public and private, and a good example of that is China. So in doing the analysis, it behooves you to say, are there cultural factors that would influence my entry into that market? And where can you get that information? Well, we've got a number of books at the library. We've got Do's and Taboos Around the World, which is quite interesting. We've got some other specific country and region guides. And then online, the country commercial guides are a really excellent resource. And let's see if it comes up for us this time. Okay, good, it did. So these are very, very useful, not just for cultural variables, but as we said, for really getting a good grasp on the political and legal environment and drilling down into things like regulations. As I said, last but not least, you'd want to look at industry indicators. Are there barriers to entry in that particular industry? Is that industry stable? What types of power do suppliers and buyers have? Are there a number of substitute products, etc.? And in terms of finding this information, the